Every now and then, the most mundane things remind me that I'm really at a Christian college. I admit that it's petty things that appeal to my New York sensibilities. Take, for example, being considerate of others. I used to brag to my friends in New York that at Wheaton, and only at Wheaton, when you work out at the fitness center, without fail, you can always expect people to wipe down their machines after they use it. Or when you walk towards the BGC and the person in front of you is holding the door for you, and you haven't even crossed College Avenue. But what's been harder for me to understand about Wheaton is this phenomenon of compassion fatigue among students. This idea of overcommitting oneself to different social issues and genuinely wanting to be Christ in the midst of. I believe it's endemic on campus. This morning I was asked to share some thoughts about an issue that has been a thorn to the church's side for the past 3 decades. Some of us have heard too much about this issue, and frankly, others not nearly enough. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. These 2 vowels and a consonant has been a slippery matter for Christians because this virus has been a nagging reminder of what is glorious about the church and what is utterly depraved. But I decided not to focus on that sticking point this morning. Rather, in the spirit of not fatiguing your compassion, I thought I would offer some reflections on why you might seriously consider not taking on another issue such as AIDS, especially AIDS in the United States, an epidemic that is increasingly affecting communities of color in poor urban and rural areas. You know, it's one thing if some of us share the opinion that HIV discriminately impacts those who are already at the margins of society, but for others who are on the fence or not even close, ask yourselves, why devote attention and resources to HIV in this country when 67% of persons with HIV live in regions south of the Sahara Desert versus 4% who live in North America? I mean, if you do the math, it's simply not a prudent use of our resources. 4%. The numbers simply don't add up to an urgent need. There are children orphaned by AIDS in Africa, and Christians have a soft spot for innocent victims. This was evident in 2002 when Bono stood on this very stage and challenged students like all of you to do something about the millions of children orphaned by AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. Jamie Drummond, the executive director of Bono's organization, Debt, AIDS, and Trade in Africa, said this, quote, "Wheaton blew Bono away. Wheaton is proving itself even more as a nerve center within America's heart and within a faith network that is waking up to the crisis in Africa," end of quote. So what I say is let's stick with what we're good at, the vulnerable children and the orphans. Let's think twice before venturing into unfamiliar territories that unnecessarily ruffle our privileged evangelical sensibilities. Territories such as Chicago, where men who have sex with men accounted for over half of all AIDS cases in 2009. And at least according to the folks at Princeton Review, Wheaton and our LGBT sisters and brothers just don't mingle very well. So maybe we should just focus our time and resources on persons who did not acquire the virus by any fault of their own. I don't know, maybe they would be more receptive to the message of Jesus. I doubt if God seriously expects us to extend ourselves to them, you know, white gay men who are at the highest risk of HIV infection. We're not alone in this logic. Do you remember Ananias in Acts 9 when God summoned him to meet with a man by the name of Saul who sought to systematically exterminate all Christians and to decimate the church in Jerusalem? A criminal act against humanity. Ananias responded, "Really? Seriously? A Roman citizen from Tarsus and a Jew from Damascus? We don't mingle very well. God, maybe you haven't heard that this man is doing great evil to your saints in Jerusalem, and now you want me to bless the brother? Really?" So we may not mingle very well with persons affected by HIV in the US. You might also consider if there really is a need for Christians to have a place at an overcrowded table. More and more resources are being allocated for HIV prevention and care, especially over the past decade. And with newer classes of medication, HIV has become a more manageable chronic illness since the mid-90s. The situation is not as dire. It's not as urgent. Even so, what can Christians realistically do about HIV in this country? Promote the use of condoms? Advocate for free needle exchange? March in the Pride Parade? It's simply not our ecclesial calling. There are other issues that Christians and the church are perhaps better poised to address. Of course, there are a growing number of African-American churches and faith networks that are actively engaged in HIV work, but they're left with no choice because HIV has become a daily reality in their community. Us, we're a small Christian liberal arts college in DuPage County, where 292 persons with HIV live compared to a little over 20,000 in Chicago. There are plenty of organizations in a city that faithfully serve persons living with HIV. It's what they do, it's what they're good at. We're out of our league, folks. Most of you, I'm sure, are not swayed by my advice to guard your compassion. In fact, maybe some of you wonder if advocating for the dignity of persons living with HIV in cities like Chicago is a timely opportunity for us to be a transformational witness to the unexplainable, nonsensical, and revolutionary news of Jesus. Maybe we desperately want to act counterculturally, because only in doing so would others begin to notice and scratch their heads, perplexed about why it matters so much for you to be an intentional presence in communities where Christians have historically avoided and even condemned. Maybe it has something to do with that cultish logo for Christ and his kingdom. Maybe it actually means something. But at the end of the day, isn't that what it's all about? Living our lives dramatically and remarkably so that it piques others' curiosity about the God we worship and we adore. Before hearing reflections from President Riken, students, faculty, and staff about what informs Christian activism in communities affected by HIV, especially here in the US, let me close with a challenge for us to try and to fatigue Christ's compassion. And we'll quickly learn that it's a tall order. Compassion is not for us to safeguard or to hoard or to muster up from within only when it comes in neat, spill-proof packages. But rather, it's intended to be exercised boldly and recklessly, and I would say faithfully, for the singular sake of Christ.
You know, I can still remember the first time I even heard about AIDS. I was a freshman in high school, and I was in French class, and I was looking at some French magazines that were there in the classroom and saw this article about AIDS. And it was really just the beginning of a public understanding of what AIDS was and what a huge health problem it would become. I really have thought from that point of AIDS as a medical issue that particularly demands a response of care and concern from the people of God.
In December 2002, the world's biggest rock star, Bono, came to campus. He was on a tour in the Midwest to make us aware of the AIDS epidemic that, coupled with profound poverty, was claiming the lives of 60,000 Africans every single day.
I think HIV/AIDS is a very complicated issue involving not just the individual, but also the family and the community. Sometimes it's very tempting for us to think of HIV/AIDS as involving just personal sin or something to do with only the personal or private aspects of behavior. But if we look at how HIV/AIDS is prevalent in the US and also in developing countries, we see that it is actually a very complicated issue, and it involves societal sin and structural sin as well.
I think we're called to see who are the orphans and the widows of our time. I certainly think that people living with HIV/AIDS are marginalized. They're marginalized not only societally, they're also marginalized politically. So in terms of public policy that addresses the issues of people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States, we see less of a commitment than we do to even people living with HIV abroad. So especially with regards to policy, how we frame people matters. So if we frame people as deserving of HIV/AIDS, whether because they're IV drug users or because they're gay, this certainly doesn't comport with how the Bible calls us to treat people. And so I think that in terms of public policy, one of the things that Christians can do specifically is to think about how to reframe this issue in a way that's compelling in a narrative sense, because narrative really matters in terms of policies that benefit marginalized people.
In his book, The Dangerous Act of Worship, Living God's Call to Justice, Mark Labberton says this: "The gospel of Jesus first nourishes us with a kind of love that comes freely, no cost benefit, and without limit, no scarcity. We need to practice living in that love and living off of that love. How do we do this? By risking giving it away." A similar example is given to us by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, in the story of Lazarus and the rich man, in which Jesus speaks of this sick Lazarus who's sitting outside the home of the rich man, always anonymous in the parable. And in that story, the rich man is condemned not because he oppresses Lazarus, but because he ignores Lazarus. It is his indifference to Lazarus that is his great crime. So when we ask the question of why is it that Christians ought to care about our neighbor, our brother and sister, in this case about persons with HIV and AIDS, the singular answer is always the same, for the same reason that Christians care about everything else, because that's what Christians do. In our particular case, the question of why should we, Wheaton College, be involved in work with and advocacy for persons with HIV and AIDS in the Chicago area, it's because this is where our home is. This is our Lazarus. This is our neighborhood.
I teach public health, so we talk a lot about HIV in a global context. But HIV, it disproportionately affects people at home. And so I think that students really like to engage in problems abroad because they feel disconnected from those cultures anyway, and it's not as close to home. But when we start to talk about differences at home, it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable. I also think that students tend to hesitate to engage in the topic so close to home. So HIV is one of those diseases that definitely hides among the poor.
You know, one of the challenges that all of us face on this campus is we have the opportunity, particularly in chapel, but also in lectures and in classes, to encounter the weightiest issues in our world today, and often to hear about them from people who really care about those issues and have a lifelong calling to address them. And there's no way that any one of us can carry the burden for all of the areas of life and ministry where the people of God should be involved as part of their kingdom work. But we can all support other Christian people who are involved in various aspects of kingdom work and support them in prayer as we have opportunity in encouragement and financial giving. And then listen to the direction of the Holy Spirit for the burdens that He wants each one of us to carry. And my hope and really my prayer for Wheaton College is that some of our students will carry a burden for the effect of AIDS that will last long after their time at Wheaton College.